Hi, my name is Andrew Orozco, and if you can't tell by the icon of Jesus, the many, many books and Bibles, and the cryptic, mysterious ancient languages that I have written on my walls, I'm very, very interested in the study of Scripture and the study of theology. And I really just want to share my passion and what I've been reading over a decade of knowledge and Scripture with anybody who's interested out there. And specifically, I want to do that by studying the Gospel of St. Matthew. I think the Gospel of St. Matthew is a really great way to jump into theology, to jump into the study of Scripture, for a lot of reasons, right? Because, well, first of all, the Bible. It's also my favorite translation of the Bible, and the translation and version of the Bible I'll be using in basically all of these videos is going to be the revised second revised standard version Catholic edition in the Ignatius Catholic Study Bible Old and New Testament. This is the best English Bible I've ever encountered. It's got the whole Bible. It's got a bunch of footnotes, essays, and maps, and I'm going to be using that during this entire and everything I do basically here in this space. And specifically, we'll be going through, like I said, the Gospel of St. Matthew. And the reason why I picked the Gospel of St. Matthew to be kind of the first thing that we jump into here is because it really gives you a survey of the entire Bible, of Old and New Testament, united in the person of Jesus Christ, right? So the Gospel of St. Matthew is one of the biographies of Jesus in the or in the New Testament. It's one of the biographies of Jesus, so it's going to give us the life of Jesus. But St. Matthew gives us the life of Jesus specifically as to how it relates to the Old Testament, right? Most people know that there's a division in the Bible, the Old Testament, which people basically understand to be the things before Jesus, and the New Testament, which is Jesus and his life and the church. But St. Matthew is really eager to impart to the reader that Jesus is the fulfillment of everything that was in the Old Testament, that Christianity in the New Testament isn't just this thing that kind of popped out in the middle of nowhere in the first century in Judea, but rather it's the fulfillment of everything that has been happening to the Jewish people for thousands of years. So he really, how do I phrase it? He really paints a picture with colors that are the Old Testament. Is one way of thinking about it. So the Old Testament is about 75% of the Bible. So three-fourths of the Bible is just prep, just I don't want to say just, but it's this beautiful story of preparation of a people awaiting their Messiah. Messiah is basically means anointed one, kind of like the chosen one, as we would understand, like in our modern English, Western world, chosen one. So St. Matthew's really concerned with telling you how the first 75% of this gigantic book, the Bible, points to this one person he's writing a biography about, Jesus of Nazareth. So it's a lot of Old Testament imagery that if we don't really pause and unpack it, we're going to miss a lot. So what I really want to do in this Bible study is go through Matthew's gospel, but also maybe a bit slowly, right? Because there's so many Old Testament references that I want to pause and pitch up a tent and unpack things, maybe in some cases verse by verse, to show how related he is to the Old Testament, right? So that's why I'm picking Matthew's gospel. I think that's the gospel we should be starting, because starting with Matthew, we get Old and New Testaments. Begin by stopping and unpacking everything. And like I said, I'll be using this Nation's Catholic Study Bible. A lot of the stuff, um, some of the stuff you can find in the footnotes. Some of the other stuff I hope to do in this series is unpack what the 2,000 years of church history has also done in its interpretation of things as well. And as obviously, if I did everything that I wanted to do in this series, I don't think the series would ever end. It's already ambitious enough to go through the whole Gospel of Matthew, and let alone stopping and doing the Old Testament references. But if I were to unpack everything that's in this Bible, we would never finish. So I really recommend you guys get the Ignatius Catholic Study Bible if you guys want to get the full experience. But I think without continuing an introduction, we should just jump right into the Gospel of St. Matthew. So, chapter 1 starts off the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David and the son of Abraham. We're already going to stop in the first verse of Matthew's gospel. This episode, if we're lucky, this episode will get probably two or a few verses done. But St. Matthew begins his gospel by talking about the two most important people in the Old Testament, Abraham and David. Now, I don't know how familiar the individuals who are going to be watching these videos are with the Old Testament, so I'm just going to explain as much as I can. Abraham is he's known as the father of the Jewish people, right? If you go to a Jew, they'll say, I'm a son of Abraham. I'm one of the descendants of Abraham. And Abraham really starts off in the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis. His story begins in chapter 12, right after a big event. So, well, I got to unpack, I got to step back even more. In Genesis, we see that it was God's plan to make humanity and to dwell with humanity. God designed the whole world to be kind of like a temple where the people, the human race, would live in, and God would be there with them. But because of the sin of Adam and Eve, we don't have too much time to unpack that. But because of the sin of Adam and Eve, the this plan that God had was derailed, so to speak, by the introduction of human sin and also death. And in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis specifically, we see a series of failures. The first big one's Adam and Eve. Second one is Noah and the flood. We're going to skip over a lot of that. And the third big one is the Tower of Babel. And in the Tower of Babel, all of the nations of the earth are dispersed. They all had one language, and these nations, these people rebel against God. I can't get too much into what happens before, but they rebel against God by building a tower. And it's likely an act of idolatry. And to punish them, God gives them a bunch of different languages, and they're dispersed throughout the world. And the later tradition will tell us that at this period also, because of their sin, God gave the demons permission to, kind of have kind of like a little quasi control over them, because every time we sin, we enter ourselves unto, we every time we sin, we leave God. Sin is leaving God is one thing that the book of Genesis really wants to tell us. So after it's in this context of continual human failure, that Abraham comes on the scene in Genesis 12, and God picks Abraham. He's going to pick this one guy, and he says to this guy, "Okay, I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to give you many children, and then kings are going to come from your descendants, and the entire earth is going to be blessed by you." So God picks Abraham, and Abraham he's an old man, very, very old, and his name means father of the people, father of many, and he has no children, absolutely no children. He's an old man with no children, and his wife is also old, and she's barren. They were never able to have kids. So God picks this guy. He says, "I'm going to give you children," and eventually, these children become the people of Israel, right? And the one of the big reasons why Matthew begins with a genealogy is because it's able to obviously track a family history, and family histories are sometimes boring to us modern Western people, except for when we have to deal with an inheritance, right? Fortunately, when somebody dies, well, they can't take your things with you, so your things go to your descendants. So genealogies are very important for tracking inheritance and who gets what. So God promised Abraham, these great blessings that through you the world is going to be blessed. So tracking your genealogy, how you were connected to Abraham, was immensely important because it showed that you were part of the family that was going to bless the world. And in this genealogy in Matthew, we kind of get this entire story of the Old Testament. The first 75% of the Bible is summarized in a quick little family tree. And the Old Testament, one way of looking at it really is just, okay, we have this human failure, then we have Abraham, and then we're tracking Abraham's descendants and seeing where this special blessing is going to fall through. Who is going to be the descendant of Abraham, who the blessing is going to come through. And a lot of the Old Testament is kind of narrowing things down more and more specifically until we as Christians would argue it climaxes in the New Testament where Jesus is the descendant, who this blessing is going to come through. Right? So that's why it's so important that Jesus is descendant of Abraham, because Abraham was given the blessing, and this blessing is going to reverse the problems in the beginning of Genesis. It's going to reverse the problems of Adam, the problems of Noah, the problems at the Tower of Babel, the problem of the human race being rebellious and ununited is going to be fixed by this blessing. And we as Christians believe that this blessing comes through Jesus Christ, right? And the other person mentioned in verse 1 is David. Some of you might be familiar with the character of David from David and Goliath. He's the same guy. He defeats, the mighty warrior Goliath as a young boy, and eventually he becomes the king of all of Israel, right? So, for those who are unaware, Abraham has some descendants. They eventually get enslaved in Egypt. They leave Egypt and return to what's modern day Israel, that part of the world. And eventually they pick for themselves a king. We're skipping over a lot of Old Testament stuff to make a long story short. David becomes the great king in Israel. And not only is he a great king, but we also read that David is going to get a blessing as well. It's part of the Abrahamic blessing. It's the narrowing of things down, right? So remember that Abraham was promised to have a lot of descendants. Well, we clearly see he had a lot of descendants. If there's enough to be a kingdom, we see that he was promised that his name would be great, that he would have kings from his line. David's certainly a fulfillment of that. But we're also trying to see, okay, where's this worldwide blessing? How is this all going to narrow in? So, in order to talk about the importance of David, David's really, really, really important for Matthew's gospel. I want to read one of the most important passages about David in the Old Testament, which is from 2 Samuel chapter number 7, right? I'm going to read it right now. Let's see. The context is that this is God speaking to King David. I'm going to start with chapter 12. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come forth from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. When he commits iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. But I will not take my merciful love from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. Unquote. So that was verses 12 to 16. So here, God is swearing to David, right, that I'm going to bless you and your descendants, and you guys are going to have a kingdom that lasts forever. And the Jews understood this to be a little mini fulfillment of what was given to Abraham. Okay, so through the kingdom, through what's going to happen with David and his descendants and the king, that's how we are going to come about blessing the world. So it was a very, very big deal. And both in Abraham and in David, God didn't just give promises. Although, a promise like, okay, I will give you this, I promise. But it was a lot more than a promise. It's what we would call, in theology, a covenant. Now, a covenant is a sacred kinship oath. It's where you swear, by God, I swear, and then by this act of swearing, give something. But in addition to just giving things, you are also, in a sense, giving yourself. It's a way that two people who aren't family become united in a family, in a sense, right? So, a modern day example of a covenant is marriage between a man and a woman, where they get together, they swear before God that they'll be faithful with each other, and they give themselves to each other. So when God is, talking to Abraham and to David, he's not just giving promises of a blessing, but he is swearing an oath. He's swearing them. They're becoming family, and he's guaranteeing that this is going to happen by an oath. And covenants are much graver than promises, right? If you break a promise, it's obviously not good. But at the end of the day, there's not too much that's going to happen. But if you break an oath, in the understanding of the Old Testament, if you break an oath, you will be cursed. You get cursed, basically. So that's why the invoking of the name of God in the swearing of an oath is a big deal. Because if you don't do what's promised in the oath, you will get cursed. You'll get destroyed. So what's the big deal about God making an oath here? God, when he swears to Abraham and to David, is saying, I swear that this is going to happen, and if it doesn't happen, I'm going to be destroyed. I'll be put under a curse. Which is absurd, right? Because God is all powerful, God can't be destroyed. So what that means, if somebody who can't be destroyed is promising you an oath, if he's swearing an oath to you, right, more than promising, then you can have certitude that he's going to do what he's going to, that he'll say what he did. He'll do what he said. Is what I'm trying to say. That God's going to be faithful to what he's giving, and it's that these promises, these oaths, these covenants that God gave in the Old Testament is really everything that the people in the life of Jesus were waiting for. They were waiting for the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant. Okay, when are we going to bless the earth? They were waiting for the fulfillment of the Davidic covenant, because the Davidic covenant promised an eternal kingdom, right? And to make a long story short, eventually the descendants of King David become so sinful, specifically by the worship of demons and the sacrificing of children. They weren't as holy as David was. By these great sins, God eventually takes the kingdom away, and the people of the Jewish people, their kingdom was conquered by the Babylonians, and then that kingdom was conquered by the Persians, and then that by the Greeks, and then that by the Romans. And when St. Matthew's gospel begins, we have the Jewish people under the oppression of the Romans, waiting for Abraham's covenant to be fulfilled, waiting for David's covenant to be fulfilled. And they were waiting for that one descendant of David, that descendant of David who was going to sit on the throne forever and who was going to bless the earth. And it's with all of this anticipation, they were looking for the Messiah, right? The chosen one. This individual who was born of Abraham, who was born of David, is going to finally be the way that God's going to be faithful, because we know that God has to be faithful. And it's this is the context that Matthew's gospel begins in. And this is what we can gather just from the first verse of the Gospel of Matthew. And if you don't know that Old Testament context, all of that's going to go over your head. So that's what I'm hoping this Bible study is going to be, for everybody, that we can begin to slowly, by going through Matthew, unpack the Old and the New Testament together in ways that help us to see that these oaths, these covenants have been fulfilled in Jesus Christ, and inspire a love and gratitude, for God in our hearts. So I really hope that this will be a beneficial series. And I see that I've already gone a long time. If I get into verse 2, we'll be here for another 20 minutes. So this first episode of our Bible study in the Gospel of Matthew is literally just in the first verse. But I hope it'll excite you, and I hope that you guys are curious, and we'll take this all to prayer. And I hope that you'll continue joining me as we study the Gospel of St. Matthew. And with that, that's all I've got for you guys today. But with that, I say, God bless.